The clink of crystal against fine china echoed softly beneath the warm hum of conversation. Waiters in crisp black uniforms moved like shadows through the opulent dining room of the Silver Oak, Chicago's most exclusive restaurant. Outside, autumn rain tapped gently on the windows, but inside, everything was polished, perfect, and precise except for what was about to unfold. At the head of the reserved table near the grand piano, Richard Matthews glanced impatiently at his platinum wristwatch. 43, powerful, and smug with success. He wasn't just attending dinner, he was orchestrating history. A $300 million international expansion deal was set to be signed tonight. One handshake with 3 top-tier executives from Japan, Germany, and Italy would elevate his real estate empire into legend. Richard liked being the man behind the glass walls of skyscrapers, the man whose name people said with weight. His executive assistant Rachel leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Tanaka, Mr. Schneider, and Mr. Romano just arrived. They're being escorted to the table. Richard nodded with that slight, rehearsed smile he wore for boardrooms and billionaires. Let's make history, he said. As he stood, adjusting his navy suit for the 5th time, his eyes caught someone moving in the corner of the room. A young waitress with a plain ponytail was setting down water glasses at a nearby table. Her shoes were shined, but old. Her apron neat, but her hands carried the hesitation of someone who didn't belong. Not in his world. He smirked and muttered to Rachel, I hope the staff doesn't ruin this. She probably can't even pronounce menu properly. Rachel winced subtly, but said nothing. Moments later, the heavy glass doors opened, revealing 3 distinguished men stepping into the room. KenjiTanaka.com, and reserved with a presence that commanded silence. Eric Schneider, bold and calculated, whose every movement felt like a negotiation. And Marco Romano, warm but sharpened, with the easy charm of a man who noticed everything, forgot nothing. They exchanged firm handshakes, the kind men make when billions rest between their fingers. Gentlemen, Richard said, welcome to Chicago. Let's begin. They sat, menus untouched, pleasantries exchanged. The mood was formal but optimistic. Everything was going exactly as Richard planned, until the waitress approached their table. She carried a tray of still water and fine glasses. Her movements were careful, deliberate, respectful. She was no more than 22, with calm eyes and a gentle poise that almost seemed misplaced here. Richard barely looked at her. He didn't need to. To him, she was background noise, a prop in his performance. But as she set the last glass down, Mr. Tanaka looked up at her, then offered a polite greeting in Japanese. The room paused. She answered him, her tone precise, her accent native. Tanaka blinked, pleasantly surprised. You speak Japanese? He asked, switching fully to the language. She smiled kindly and nodded. Yes, and I also studied in Osaka for a year. Before Richard could say anything, Mr. Schneider joined in, this time in rapid German. Again. She answered smoothly, clear, confident. Then Marco Romano leaned in, curious. E parli anche l'italiano, she chuckled. Sti signore anche l'italiano. By now, the entire table was still. No one reached for their wine. No one moved. Richard's smile faded into confusion, then something colder. She's just the waitress, he said quietly. But Marco leaned forward, intrigued. What's your name? Emily Parker. Sir? And what do you do, besides serve water? She straightened a little. I'm finishing my master's in linguistic anthropology. I work here to cover tuition. The room was silent, but the air had shifted. You speak how many languages? Schneider asked. 9, she said simply. Fluently. I'm still learning to more. Richard scoffed. Well, that's very nice. But tonight's about business. But the executives didn't turn their attention back to Richard. They were still looking at Emily with genuine respect. Tanaka tapped the table. Perhaps, before we sign anything, we should hear her perspective if she's willing. Richard's eyes widened. She's not part of this negotiation. Emily looked between the men. I read your company's annual reports last week, she said gently. Just for fun, I might have a few ideas, especially about cultural rollout challenges. Rachel, watching from the side, covered her mouth in disbelief. The next 10 minutes unfolded like a dream. Emily, the girl Richard had mocked, calmly laid out 3 thoughtful points that addressed concerns none of the executives had mentioned aloud, but had privately discussed. Each man exchanged surprised glances. Romano leaned back, impressed. She's right, he murmured. Richard couldn't believe it. His moment was being hijacked by a waitress with scuffed shoes and 9 languages, but the room had already changed. The spotlight wasn't his anymore, and what came next would flip everything upside down. Asterisk the next morning, the headlines didn't mention Richard Matthews. They didn't talk about the $300 million deal or the luxurious dinner at the Silver Oak. No, the name that appeared on blogs, on whispered lips in executive lounges, and in messages sent across time zones was hers. Emily Parker, waitress, speaks 9 languages and impresses world leaders at high-stakes dinner. The story traveled fast, faster than any press release Richard had ever approved. But it wasn't just the shock of a young woman matching billion-dollar minds word for word. It was the grace with which she did it. There had been no arrogance, No revenge, just quiet confidence. And that rattled him more than any public scandal. Richard hadn't slept. He stared at the empty screen in his penthouse study as the city lights blinked outside. His empire was intact, yes, but his certainty shattered, because for the first time, his power hadn't commanded the room. Hers had. By mid-afternoon, his assistant Rachel stepped into his office with hesitant urgency. "Sir, you need to see this." On her tablet, a video was going viral. Someone at the restaurant had recorded the moment, Emily speaking calmly, in 3 languages as the executives leaned in, captivated. The clip ended with Schneider saying, "She should be leading this project." Rachel stood quietly as Richard's face went pale. "Where is she now?" he asked, barely above a whisper. "She didn't come in today. I checked with the restaurant. They said she gave notice. Apparently she's taking a research fellowship. In Geneva, he repeated, stunned, double quotes, yes. Through the Global Cultural Exchange Initiative, starts next week. Full scholarship." Richard leaned back in his chair. Geneva, the very city he had failed to break into for years. He had pitched, sponsored, and flown in advisors, but couldn't establish roots. And now not a girl, this waitress, was stepping in with open arms waiting for her. "I want a meeting with her," he said suddenly. Rachel hesitated. "Sir, with all due respect, I think she's moved on." But Richard was already reaching for his phone. Something deeper had been stirred in him, just ego, but something unfamiliar, something uncomfortable. Regret. Later that evening, Emily sat in her small apartment, cardboard boxes stacked around her. Her hands were ink-stained from scholarship documents. The only light came from a desk lamp and the city twinkling outside her window. She wasn't watching the viral video. She hadn't even opened the news. There was a knock at her door. She opened it slowly, surprised to find a neatly dressed man in a long coat holding a single envelope. "Miss Parker?" he asked gently. "Yes." He handed her the envelope. "From Mr. Matthews personally." She paused, then took it. "Thank you." The man nodded and walked away. Inside the envelope was a handwritten note. "Emily, sometimes life reminds us of who we are, not with a whisper, but with a mirror. Last night, you showed me mine. I saw what I had missed, ignored, or dismissed. You didn't just speak languages. You translated dignity back into a room that had forgotten it. If you ever choose to return, there's a seat waiting for you at the serving table, but at the board table. No strings, no conditions, just respect." Richard. Emily read it once. Then again. Her expression didn't change. She folded the note quietly, walked to her bookshelf, and slipped it between 2 heavy volumes on global discourse theory. Then she picked up her pen and kept writing her thesis. What Richard didn't know yet was that the real story hadn't even begun, because what Emily was about to do in Geneva would make last night look like a prelude. And this time, the world wouldn't just watch her rise, they'd follow her. 2 weeks passed. Geneva felt like a dream. Emily hadn't dared to imagine the snow-capped mountains or elegant cafes, but the walls that welcomed her, rooms where her voice was not only heard, but sought. She wasn't pouring water anymore. She was pouring insight into discussions that shaped international education policies, heritage preservation programs, and global cooperation. Her gift wasn't just language, it was connection. But back in Chicago, Richard Matthews was unraveling. His deal, the one he thought was sealed that night, had gone silent. Schneider's office sent a cryptic message about revisiting cultural alignment. Tanaka's team declined further meetings. Romano, once warm and open, had stopped replying. Entirely, no explanations, just doors closing. He knew why. It wasn't that Emily had embarrassed him. She hadn't. It was that she had made the room sound once. People truly see something. They can't unsee it. She'd revealed the gap between leadership and humility. Richard sat alone in the conference room of his downtown office tower, a deal memo torn in half on the table in front of him. The silence around him was louder than the applause he once craved. Then, something unexpected happened. An email popped into his inbox. Subject line, Emily Parker. Opportunity to collaborate. He opened it immediately. It wasn't from her. It was from Dr. Leila Arman, director of the Geneva Institute for Global Dialogue. She wrote of Emily's early contributions. How, in just 10 days, she'd unified 3 fragmented committees. How her multilingual training program had been fast-tracked to a UN advisory review. And then, the line that hit him hardest. We understand she once worked with your firm. If you're still interested in international expansion, we would consider her recommendation for partnership if she supports it. She held the key now, not by power, but by presence. Rachel found him staring out the window later that day. Should I prepare a reply? She asked softly. No, he said. I need to do this in person. 4 days later, Emily stood in a marble-floored corridor outside a conference room in Geneva. She wore a dark green blazer, simple, elegant. A badge hung around her neck, not as a waitress, but as a speaker. A young intern tapped her shoulder. Miss Parker, there's someone here asking for you. He flew in from the US, said he won't disturb. Just wanted 5 minutes. She turned, expecting a colleague. Instead, it was him. Richard Matthews stood there, not in his usual tailored armor, but in something more human, less polished. His Eyes met hers, but his voice for once didn't lead it. Asked, "Would you hear me out?" She nodded, slightly cautious, but curious. He followed her into a quiet side room. For a few moments neither spoke. Then Richard finally said, "I came here thinking I needed to win something back. A deal. A chance. Maybe even my name. But that's not why I should be here." Emily waited. He breathed in slowly. "That night, I thought you were invisible. That was my mistake. You weren't invisible, I just wasn't looking. And now that I am, I realize I've been blind in too many rooms." Still, she said nothing. "I can't undo the moment I dismissed you, but I can honor what you've built since. And I can offer you something different now. Not a title, not a favor, just space. If you ever want it, to lead, to design, to change things." Emily looked at him, not with resentment, but with a quiet kind of strength that couldn't be shaken. "Didn't speak up that night to prove something," she said. "I spoke up because the world deserves better translators of language, yes, but also of dignity." Richard nodded, eyes wet. As he left the room, he wasn't sure if she'd ever reach back, but what he didn't realize was this: she already had. Just not for his world. For hers. And what she would do next would not only rewrite her story, but reshape an entire generation's belief in what voices truly matter. The auditorium lights dimmed, and silence settled like velvet. Hundreds of delegates from over 40 nations leaned forward in their seats as Emily stepped onto the stage at the World Cultural Innovation Forum. The woman who once walked invisible between tables now stood beneath the gaze of leaders, thinkers, and dreamers. But what they didn't know was, this wasn't the biggest room she would ever command. It was just the beginning. She adjusted the mic gently. Her voice was calm, unwavering. Language is not just communication, it's connection. It's how we say, "I see you." And too often, the most powerful people speak the least important words, while the quietest voices hold the truths we need most. A slow ripple of applause followed, but her words didn't need noise to matter. They settled deep. At the back of the hall, Richard stood unnoticed, hands in his pockets, watching not as a tycoon, but as a student. Since returning to Chicago, he had started something new, quietly funding cross-cultural literacy programs and sponsoring multilingual education in underserved schools. Not because it fixed what he had done, but because, for the first time, he understood what hadn't been done. He didn't want credit, he just wanted to be useful. As Emily left the stage, surrounded by well-wishers and global journalists, a familiar face emerged from the crowd, Kenji Tanaka. He bowed respectfully, then smiled. "Miss Parker, you haven't just impressed us, you've changed us." She smiled back. "I only reminded people of what they already knew." Later that evening, under the warm lights of a small Geneva cafe, Emily sat with her old notebook. Pages worn, ink faded, but dreams still alive. She didn't know the cameras had caught her speech. She didn't know a clip was going viral. Again, what she knew was that every step forward meant lifting others to. Back in Chicago, a young waitress named Alina sat on her break, scrolling through her phone. She had just been told by a customer to smile more and talk less. She felt small until she saw Emily's video. She clicked play. 10 minutes later, her hands trembled, but not with fear, with fire. She didn't know it yet, but that video would inspire her to apply for a language scholarship. One she would get, and 5 years later, she would sit on her own stage, in her own spotlight, saying, "I once thought no one like me belonged in rooms like this, until someone showed me we do." What Emily started wasn't just a response, it was a ripple, a movement. And for Richard, watching from the sidelines wasn't bitter, it was humbling. Because sometimes the most powerful redemption is knowing that even if your chapter ends, someone else's story can rise from a tent soar far beyond where yours began. The sky above Geneva had turned a pale lavender by dawn, casting a soft glow through the tall windows of the Language Institute where Emily often stayed long after hours. But today, she wasn't alone. A line of young scholars stood outside her office, door students, interns, translators in training. All of them carried notebooks, dreams, and stories, hoping for one thing: 10 minutes of her time. Because now, around the world, Emily Parker's name wasn't just trending, it was transforming lives. Her message had reached refugee camps, rural schools, and diplomatic circles alike. Governments requested her insight, universities wanted her voice on panels, yet she remained the same, calm, focused, and rooted in something that even her global fame couldn't touch: purpose. What no one knew was that she had quietly established a nonprofit, its name, The Bridge. And its mission was simple: train and empower youth from marginalized backgrounds to become global communicators. Not just linguistically, but emotionally, culturally, and ethically. She believed the world didn't just need speakers, it needed listeners. Back in Chicago, in a much smaller and quieter office, Richard Matthews stared at a new proposal laid out before him. It wasn't for a skyscraper or a luxury property. It was for a public library, in one of the city's forgotten corners. A library that would include a language lab, a cultural literacy hub, and scholarships in Emily's name, though she had no idea he was behind it. His assistant stepped in. "Sir, the press is asking if you'll be attending the Global Philanthropy Gala. Miss Parker is the keynote. Richard looked down at the floor. No, let her have that moment. But a part of him hoped, just maybe, she'd mention that night, not to shame him, not to reopen wounds, but to show the world what can rise from broken things. When Emily did take the stage that evening in Paris, she wore a simple silver pin, a tiny globe, a gift from her mother, long before the world ever listened. The room fell silent. I wasn't always seen, she began. In fact, the first time I was ever truly heard. I wasn't even trying to speak. I was just being myself. And someone's chose to listen. There was a pause. Then she continued. But I want to thank the moment that almost silenced me, because it made me realize something. When someone underestimates you, they hand you a gift. A mirror. You get to decide what reflection you show them. That night, I showed mine, and it changed everything. The crowd erupted, not with applause but with admiration. Across the ocean, in a modest community center, Alina, the young waitress Emily, unknowingly inspired, was now leading her first translation workshop for refugee children. She had no stage, no cameras. But when one little boy from Syria finally smiled after she explained a word he didn't understand, she felt it, that same ripple Emily had started. And in that moment, far from the gala, away from the praise and the prestige, the truest part of the story lived on. Not in the viral clip, not in the money, but in the hearts that had been opened, because what Emily had done wasn't just answer mockery with mastery. She had rewritten the meaning of voice, and through her, the quiet had become powerful, the overlooked, unforgettable. The rain had just started to fall in soft patterns against the windows of the airport cafe when Emily opened her notebook for what might be the final time in a long while. A flight to Kenya waited at gate 19. Her project there, a multilingual education initiative for displaced children, would be the largest she had ever led. But before boarding, she needed to finish something. Not a speech, not a press release. Letter. To Richard Matthews. It had been nearly a year since their paths last crossed, and though much had changed, one truth remained. His actions that night, misguided and harsh, had unintentionally sparked a movement. Not because he was powerful, but because she chose not to respond with bitterness but with purpose. She began to write. Mr. Matthews, you once asked if I would hear you out. I did, and now it's my turn. When I stood at your table in that restaurant, I wasn't waiting for validation. I was doing my job. Quietly, invisibly. You showed me what it feels like to be looked through, not at, and yet, that moment gifted me something no award ever could. The clarity to know my worth has never depended on recognition. So thank you, not for the insult, but for what came after, for showing me how fragile power can be when it's not rooted in respect, and for choosing to grow. I heard about the library, about the scholarships, and that means more than you. No, this isn't about redemption. This is about redefinition. We all get a chance to rewrite ourselves. You took yours. I'm taking mine, across oceans, across languages, across broken systems that still silence far too many. If you ever want to collaborate, not for headlines, but for change, my door is open. In the language of the Messiah, Oling, thank you deeply. Emily. She tore the page gently, folded it, and handed it to a courier with instructions to deliver it personally, not through a PR firm, not through a lawyer, but to Richard's hands only. Hours later, Richard sat alone in that same silver oak booth, the scene of his fall. The restaurant had changed. New management, new lighting. But to him, it still held the echo of that night. He opened the letter, slowly, and when he finished reading it, something he hadn't felt in years washed over him. Not guilt, not pride, but peace. He pulled out his phone, not to send a message, but to look at the photo now framed in his office. A candid shot someone had taken at the Global Philanthropy Gala. Emily wasn't even looking at the camera. She was smiling, down at a child holding a microphone, guiding them through their very first speech. That was her legacy, not just being heard, but making space for others to speak. As Emily's plane soared through the clouds toward Africa, her name continued to travel further than she ever could. Through classrooms, through conversations, through lives quietly changed by the knowledge that brilliance wears many faces and doesn't always speak first. And somewhere, in a tiny village school yet untouched by internet or electricity, a little girl was learning her first word in English. She didn't know the name Emily Parker, but one day she would, because voices like hers, like Emily's, don't disappear after the applause. They echo. Forever.